it is understood that the Archewell Foundation did not pay the necessary fees correctly and was unaware of the issue until the delinquency notice was issued.
The first call did not come from a lawyer. It came from a publicist, whispering that something had gone wrong in Los Angeles. By dawn, the rumor had crossed the Atlantic. By noon, it had reached palace desks that no longer claimed jurisdiction, yet still felt the tremor. The name at the center was familiar: Meghan Markle. The other was unexpected: George Clooney. What followed was not an announcement, but a sudden hardening of silence. Phones unanswered, statements delayed, allies retreating into careful distance, and inside a foundation built on image and ideals, questions began to surface about money, representation, and truth. We examine how a whisper of legal action became a rupture, why former supporters went quiet, and how one allegation threatened to redraw the narrative Meghan had fought to control.
We're talking, of course, about George Clooney. But if Harry and Meghan really needed to realise just how far they'd fallen, all they have to look at is their celebrity radar.
Los Angeles woke up to a different kind of noise that Monday, the kind that does not come from sirens or traffic, but from phones vibrating at once. At a public relations firm on Wilshire Boulevard, junior staff refreshed inboxes while senior partners stood by the windows, staring down at the city. The name moving across group chats was Meghan Markle. The other was George Clooney. What linked them, according to the chatter, was not a red carpet or a charity gala, but a legal rumor that had not yet found its way into print. Inside the offices of Archewell Foundation, the mood shifted before anyone said a word. Scheduled calls were postponed. A briefing memo prepared the night before was quietly pulled from circulation. One staffer later described the atmosphere as brittle, like a room waiting for a pane of glass to break. No lawsuit had been confirmed, but the allegation carried weight because of who it involved and what it suggested. Trust, once questioned, does not wait for paperwork. The relationship between the Sussexes and Clooney had always been described as warm but distant, built more on alignment of values than personal intimacy. They shared public causes, attended overlapping events, and spoke the same philanthropic language. That history made the rumor harder to dismiss. If a legal action was even being considered, insiders said, it would not be impulsive. Clooney's reputation for caution mattered here. His name alone shifted the calculus inside Archewell from dismissal to damage control. Meghan was not in the office that morning. She was at home in Montecito, where the ocean view usually signaled control and calm. According to people briefed on the situation, she received the call shortly after 7. The words legal exposure and misrepresentation were enough to change the day. By mid-morning, her week schedule had been erased. A planned appearance tied to women's leadership was quietly shelved, officially for logistical reasons. Unofficially, no one wanted her on a stage answering questions. Across the Atlantic, the story landed differently. At Kensington and Buckingham Palace, there was no obligation to respond, but there was interest. Former colleagues still tracked developments involving the Duchess of Sussex, not out of loyalty, but out of institutional reflex. A former royal communications advisor noted that any controversy tied to Meghan inevitably reflected back on the monarchy, even years after her departure. The palace, though removed, was not unaffected. By late afternoon, lines hardened. Inside Archewell, two camps formed. One group argued for speed and transparency, pushing to release a statement, denying everything and naming no names. Another warned that any statement could elevate a rumor into a headline. The antagonist in the room was not Clooney, at least not yet. It was uncertainty. Every hour without clarity widened the gap between those who believed silence was safety and those who feared it was surrender. Outside, the media began circling. Entertainment reporters in Los Angeles framed the story as a potential rift in Hollywood. British tabloids took a sharper angle, focusing on credibility and past grievances. Neither had confirmation, but both had momentum. A legal analyst on a cable news panel speculated openly about nonprofit compliance in California, mentioning audits and donor disclosures without citing Archewell directly. The effect was the same. The foundation's name entered a conversation it could not control. Meghan's emotional state became a topic of its own. Sources used careful language, describing her as overwhelmed and deeply upset. One person familiar with the call said she cried, not out of fear of court, but out of betrayal. Whether that perception was accurate mattered less than how it played publicly. In crisis moments, emotion can humanize or undermine. Advisors debated whether her distress should remain private or be acknowledged. There was no consensus. As evening approached, A second complication emerged. Donors began asking questions. Not accusations, just requests for reassurance. Was everything in order? Were reports exaggerated? Could someone clarify? Each inquiry added pressure. Archewell's leadership convened again, this time with legal counsel present. They reviewed past statements, grant descriptions, and promotional language. Nothing obvious stood out, but that offered little comfort. In legal disputes, perception often precedes proof. The palace, meanwhile, was quietly dividing as well. Some senior figures believed this was precisely why distance from the Sussexes had been necessary, proof that controversy followed them wherever they went. Others worried that watching Meghan struggle without support looked cold, even vindictive. The monarchy's internal divide was not about intervention, but about interpretation. Was this an inevitable reckoning or an unfortunate pile-on? Late that night, a message circulated among reporters that a filing was imminent. No document surfaced, but the phrase attributed to Clooney's camp was stark and damaging. She lied about everything. No context, no attribution on the record, just enough to change the temperature. By then, the silence that morning had become a roar of speculation. Meghan sat with advisors until after midnight, Montecito quiet around them. The decision was not whether to fight, but how. Denial risked escalation. Silence risked narrative collapse. Somewhere between those poles, a path had to be chosen, and quickly. The story had moved beyond rumor into belief, and belief is harder to undo than any lawsuit. By Tuesday morning, the story had acquired shape, even without confirmation. In Los Angeles, legal correspondents began calling nonprofit attorneys, not asking about Archewell Foundation directly, but about how quickly a complaint could be drafted when donors believed they had been misled. The answers were cautious but unsettling. In California, intent mattered less than representation. If money moved based on a promise that could not be substantiated, exposure followed.
On launching her new lifestyle brand, and she's getting that up and running and sending gifts to her celebrity friends in California, and it shows that that's where their focus is right now. Their focus isn't on their...
Inside Archewell's temporary war room, laptops lined the table, each open to a different document. Grant summaries, impact reports, public speeches. Every word Meghan had signed off on was suddenly re-examined. The antagonist was no longer a rumor, it was language. Phrases once written to inspire now read like liabilities when stripped of context. A senior advisor pointed to a paragraph describing program reach and asked a simple question. Can we prove this, line by line? Across town, agents and managers began quietly advising clients to pause any visible association with the foundation. No one wanted to be seen choosing sides before facts were known. This was not betrayal, aides insisted, but survival. In Hollywood, distance is the first response to uncertainty. George Clooney's absence from the conversation only sharpened the tension. His silence was interpreted as deliberation, not retreat. Meghan spent the day on calls, her voice controlled but strained. According to one person briefed on the discussions, she pushed back against the framing of the allegation. She argued that intent mattered, that good faith mattered, that impact could not always be reduced to spreadsheets. Legal counsel did not disagree, but reminded her that courts rarely weigh emotion. What mattered was what had been promised and what could be demonstrated. By midday, a draft statement existed, then disappeared. It denied wrongdoing without addressing specifics, a tactic designed to reassure donors while avoiding escalation. Another advisor warned it sounded evasive. The internal divide hardened. One faction believed speed could smother speculation. The other believed patience would expose weakness in the claim. Meghan listened, increasingly isolated at the head of the table, caught between loyalty to her own narrative and the realities of legal optics. In London, the tone shifted again. British outlets began revisiting earlier controversies, drawing lines between past accusations of exaggeration and the present allegation. Palace sources, speaking anonymously, described a familiar pattern. Not malice, they said, but overreach. Inside royal households, words are weighed because they must withstand scrutiny. That culture clash resurfaced, years later, as a quiet point of judgment. The phrase circulating in American media, vaguely attributed to Clooney's side, caused particular damage. She lied about everything. Its power lay in its simplicity. It did not accuse a single act. It questioned character. Advisors debated whether confronting the phrase directly would dignify it. Meghan wanted to know where it came from. No one could answer. The absence of a named accuser made the defense abstract and exhausting. late afternoon brought another blow. A philanthropic watchdog organization announced it was reviewing several high-profile foundations for compliance. A routine process timed disastrously. Archewell was not named, but the coincidence fed suspicion. Social media filled the gap, connecting dots that had not been confirmed. Screenshots of old interviews circulated alongside speculative captions. Each share widened the narrative beyond legal circles into public opinion. Meghan retreated briefly, stepping outside to the garden. Those moments, aides said, were when the emotion surfaced. Anger gave way to something closer to disbelief. She had built Archewell, she believed, to escape the rigid structures of the palace, to act quickly and visibly. Now that speed was being used against her. One advisor later said that was the day she realized freedom carried its own rules. As evening approached, legal counsel outlined possible scenarios. If a lawsuit was filed, even a weak one, discovery could force disclosure of internal communications, emails, drafts, deliberations. The prospect alone was destabilizing. Meghan asked whether Clooney would really pursue that path. No one knew. His reputation suggested restraint, but reputations cut both ways. If he believed his name or money had been misused, restraint could harden into resolve. The palace factions watched from afar. Those who had warned against blending celebrity and charity felt vindicated. Others worried that public humiliation, if it came, would appear cruel. The monarchy's antagonist here was not Meghan, but the modern media cycle it struggled to understand. No statement was issued. Silence, again, was chosen. But this time it felt less strategic and more inevitable. By nightfall, the allegation had moved from whispered possibility to accepted risk. Meghan convened one final call, insisting on clarity. Either the foundation would confront the claim head-on, or it would prepare for legal battle. There would be no half measures. The advisors exchanged looks. The stakes were no longer about reputation alone. They were about survival. The shift happened quietly, not with a filing but with framing. By Wednesday, the question was no longer whether a lawsuit existed, but whose version of events would settle first in the public mind. Inside Archewell Foundation, advisors stopped asking how to stop the story and began asking how to survive it. The American media split almost immediately. Entertainment outlets treated the situation as a personal feud, a falling out between celebrities who once shared stages and donors. Legal analysts took a colder view, mapping out hypothetical claims and remedies as if the paperwork were already stamped. British coverage was sharper still. Commentators framed the situation as a credibility crisis, revisiting old interviews and speeches, measuring them against the present moment with forensic interest.
And Pandora, the dramas just seem to continue. So can you tell us about this issue with the Archewell Foundation, which hit the news in a really big way this week?
Meghan felt the divide acutely. On one call, a United States publicist urged her to show vulnerability, to humanize the moment before it hardened into judgment. On the next, a British crisis consultant warned that public emotion could be read as manipulation. She was being pulled between two instincts, empathy and restraint, neither offering certainty. According to someone present, she asked a pointed question. If I say nothing, do they assume guilt? No one answered directly. The antagonist had evolved. It was no longer George Clooney, whose silence remained total, nor was it the legal system. It was momentum. Each hour without a definitive statement allowed others to speak for her. Anonymous sources multiplied. Some claimed to know the details of donor dissatisfaction. Others alleged internal mismanagement without evidence. The lack of confirmation did not slow the narrative. It accelerated it. Inside the foundation, factions hardened further. One senior staffer argued that the only way to break the cycle was transparency at any cost, including releasing internal documents proactively. Another warned that doing so could expose the organization to risks far beyond the current allegation. The debate grew tense, personal. Loyalty was questioned, motives scrutinized. Meghan listened, visibly exhausted, as people she trusted disagreed sharply in front of her.
They were handed a delinquency notice. This is due to the fact that a cheque apparently had gone missing in the post or wasn't delivered, and this was on public record.
Across the Atlantic, palace watchers noted the familiar pattern of isolation. Former royal aides, speaking privately, observed that Meghan had always struggled most when surrounded by competing voices. The palace, for all its rigidity, had offered a single chain of command. Here, in Montecito, authority was diffuse. Every advisor had a theory. None could guarantee an outcome. The Clooney factor loomed larger precisely because he did not engage. His reputation as disciplined and strategic led his silence to be read as deliberate. Legal observers speculated that if action was coming, it would be measured, not emotional. That interpretation unsettled Archewell's team. A loud accuser can be discredited. A quiet one is harder to predict. By Thursday morning, donor reactions began to leak. Not withdrawals, but pauses. Commitments delayed, calls postponed. For a foundation built on momentum and visibility, hesitation was damaging. Meghan was briefed on each development, her expression tightening with every update. She pushed back against the idea that perception alone could undo years of work. An advisor responded bluntly. Perception is the work. The palace divide mirrored the Archewell split. One faction believed this moment proved the Sussex strategy had always been flawed, too dependent on narrative control. Another worried that allowing the story to metastasize without a counterweight would look vindictive by proxy. There was no appetite for intervention, but there was quiet concern about how far the damage could spread. That afternoon, a decision was made. Archewell would not issue a broad denial. Instead, it would prepare a detailed response, contingent on whether a formal legal step emerged. The choice was strategic but risky. It bought time at the cost of silence, Meghan agreed reluctantly. According to one person present, she said she felt as though she were waiting for a storm she could see but not outrun. Visually, the contrast was stark. Paparazzi images showed Meghan leaving her home, sunglasses on, posture rigid, no statements, no gestures. Online, the images were dissected for meaning. In one frame, her jaw clenched. In another, her eyes were downcast. Analysts spoke about body language as if it were evidence. The human cost of scrutiny became secondary to the appetite for interpretation. By evening, the phrase that had haunted the week returned in force. She lied about everything. It appeared in a headline attributed to unnamed sources close to Clooney's camp. Still no quote on the record. Still no filing. But now it was embedded. Meghan read the headline herself, according to aides, and finally reacted with anger rather than tears. She demanded to know who was feeding the line to reporters. No one could tell her. The stakes were clear now. If a lawsuit materialized, it would be fought publicly and privately. If it did not, the absence would not undo the damage already done. Reputation, once questioned, does not reset on its own. As night fell over Montecito, the foundation's leadership prepared for both outcomes, aware that the next move might not be theirs to make. By the end of the week, the question had shifted again. It was no longer whether Archewell Foundation would face a lawsuit, but whether the damage had already been done without one. In crisis management, there is a point at which legal outcomes matter less than reputational gravity. Archewell had crossed it. Friday morning brought no filing, no court docket update, no confirmation from George Clooney or his representatives. And yet, the absence did not restore calm. Instead, it created a vacuum that others continued to fill. Commentators began asking whether the threat of legal action had been enough on its own, whether pressure without process was now a tool of influence in the celebrity philanthropy world. Inside Archewell, exhaustion replaced urgency. Staff moved more slowly, conversations shorter. Advisors who had argued fiercely days earlier now spoke in careful, measured tones, as if volume itself carried risk. Meghan sat through briefings with a fixed expression, absorbing updates about donor sentiment, media tracking, and social engagement metrics. None of it offered relief. The numbers did not collapse, but they softened. Engagement dipped, sentiment skewed negative, confidence eroded quietly. Meghan's emotional state shifted again, this time toward resolve. Those around her described a narrowing of focus. She stopped asking how to fix the narrative and began asking what could be salvaged. The distinction mattered. One was about perception, the other was about reality. She instructed her team to prepare internal documentation as if discovery were inevitable, regardless of whether a lawsuit would be filed. Transparency, she said, would no longer be reactive. It would be structural. The antagonist, by then, had fully revealed itself. It was not Clooney, who remained absent, nor the media, which simply followed incentives. It was belief itself. Archewell had been built on trust, on the idea that intention and impact aligned. Once that alignment was questioned, every past success became subject to reinterpretation. Programs once praised were re-examined for scale. Partnerships once celebrated were scrutinized for substance.
So the Archewell Foundation was set up when Harry and Meghan left the UK to go to California. And a lot of their charity work is through this foundation. Now this week...
Across the Atlantic, palace insiders drew their own conclusions. Some saw this as a cautionary tale about stepping outside institutional guardrails. Others recognized a deeper shift. The monarchy had long understood that credibility is cumulative and fragile. In royal households, claims are underpromised and over-documented for a reason. Watching Meghan confront this lesson in the open stirred discomfort, even among those who had opposed her choices. British commentators began reframing the story yet again. Without a lawsuit, they asked, what remained? The answer was reputation. The phrase that had dominated the week lingered, untethered from evidence but impossible to erase. She lied about everything. It was now less an accusation than a lens through which critics viewed her work. Supporters pushed back, arguing that complexity had been flattened into cruelty. The debate hardened along familiar lines. In Montecito, Meghan held a closed-door meeting with senior advisors and trustees. According to one person briefed on the discussion, she acknowledged mistakes without conceding wrongdoing. She spoke about speed, ambition, and the pressure to demonstrate impact quickly in a skeptical world. She admitted that language meant to inspire might have overreached. The room was quiet. For the first time all week, no one interrupted. The decision that emerged was understated but significant. Archewell would commission an independent review of its operations, not as a response to litigation, but as a statement of principle. The move carried risk. Reviews uncover flaws by design. But Meghan believed the alternative was worse. Silence had failed, ambiguity had failed. Only the structure remained. When the plan leaked to the press, reactions were mixed. Some praised the move as accountability. Others dismissed it as performative. Clooney's camp remained silent. Legal analysts speculated that an independent review could deter litigation by preemptively addressing concerns. Or it could invite scrutiny by confirming vulnerability. There were no guarantees. There never were. The human cost, however, was undeniable. Meghan's public appearances ceased entirely. Friends described her as withdrawn but determined. She limited calls to a small circle. Harry, largely absent from the narrative until then, took on a more visible internal role, attending meetings and mediating disagreements. Their partnership, aides said, was under strain but intact. Crisis has a way of clarifying priorities. The palace watched as the story cooled, not because it resolved, but because attention moved on. Another scandal, another headline. That, too, was instructive. Reputation damage does not always explode. Sometimes it fades into a permanent shadow. The monarchy understood this well. It survives not by erasing controversy, but by outlasting it. By the following week, the immediate crisis had passed. No lawsuit was filed, no retraction issued. The phrase that had ignited the fire remained unchallenged in the public record. Neither proven nor withdrawn, Archewell continued operating, altered but standing. Meghan returned to limited work, avoiding cameras, focusing on internal reform. The final assessment, among those closest to the situation, was sobering. This had not been a legal battle. It had been a battle over credibility, in an era that rewards certainty and punishes nuance. Meghan had entered that era with confidence and discovered its cost. Whether she would recover depended not on vindication, but on patience. In the end, the story did not offer a verdict. It offered a warning. In a world where influence travels faster than facts, belief becomes both currency and weapon. Meghan Markle learned that lesson not in a courtroom but in the space between silence and accusation. And once learned, it could not be unlearned. Stories like this rarely end with clear winners or losers. They end with questions about trust, power, and consequence. If you want more investigations into the forces shaping modern royalty and celebrity influence, subscribe, share your thoughts, and join us for the next deep dive.